Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Anthony Peake's Consciousness Hour, also called In Conversation. Today's guest is somebody whose work really fascinates me. And the reason why his work fascinates me is that although he's been coming from a very different direction, he's come to similar conclusions to myself about the status of consciousness, of coma, near-death experiences, and many other things. Now, many years ago, I think it was around about 1979, I came across an album called Sleeper Catcher by an Australian rock band called Little River Band. And on that album, there was this wonderful song. And basically the song's lyric goes, there are so many paths up the mountain, but the view from the top is still the same.
Oh.
And I feel that this is something that is now happening. More and more of us are joining the same dots and coming to similar conclusions. Now, Alan's book that we'll be talking about today is called Coma and Near-Death Experiences, The Beautiful, Disturbing and Dangerous World of the Unconscious, which Alan wrote with his wife Beverly. Now, I consider this book to be of profound importance. It is of profound importance because it's touching upon an area that people don't talk about, where people are placed in ICUs, when they're put into comas and everything else. And it's a very, very sometimes dangerous area, which Alan discusses in his book. But before we start, Alan, your background is fascinating from your website. That photograph of you in Afghanistan, for instance, looking incredibly cool.
Yes.
Really, really good. But can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into the areas that we are both fascinated in?
Well, it wasn't intentional. It began during COVID. I mean, my background is foreign affairs, and I write about tech, and I work for the BBC, Sky News, and various people. COVID happened, the pandemic. I'm at home, haven't got much to do. And I found myself watching too much TV news, as I think many of us did. And I started to notice a pattern. And I wondered why so many people with COVID were being placed into medically induced comas. And I just wondered, well, how does that work? Is it like being in stasis in a sci-fi movie? And do you dream? And I just wanted to know. And this set me on a path that has ultimately changed my entire world outlook. I used to think dead meant dead. Now I don't believe that at all. I believe consciousness does persist beyond death. If you'd asked me this prior to the pandemic, I would probably have laughed at you. Now I consider this, it's just the way it is. It's like the penny dropped. As Jeffrey Kuiper would say, I had a flit. And here I am. So here I am talking to you now down the line, having spoken to so many people who survived coma. They're amazing stories. And honestly, if you're placed into a medically induced coma, you are seriously ill. You are close to death's door. And the meds just push you that bit further. And if you survive, and to be frank, not that many do, the mortality rate is shocking. Those that do survive tend to be very, very strong individuals. I don't just mean physically, although that really helps, but mentally strong people. And the thing is, I got to know a lot of these coma survivors, not just by phoning them up, having an interview, and then writing it all up. Most of the people, in fact, almost all of them, I had to spend time talking to and explaining what I was finding out, getting their views on different things. And bit by bit, people would eventually tell me their stories. And I got the distinct impression that they were once another kind of person to the person that they are now. In many cases, they seemed withdrawn, shy. I covered a lot of wards. I've had PTSD myself, and I can recognize it in other people. And I recognize PTSD in almost every single one, bar two or three, that I spoke to. So it's taken me on an incredible journey, as I say, that's changed my entire outlook. I've met some of the finest people, including the wonderful doctors and nurses and other medical specialists. And it's been the most remarkable journey. And as I say, here I am now.
So how did you start? I mean, effectively, your starting point, I'm interested in medically induced comas and the implications of COVID. But how did you then go about finding people who's had these experiences?
Okay, yeah. I mean, the first port of call, I think, like most people, I didn't have ChatGPT then. So I went to Google and I said, medically induced coma. Just tell me about that. And it will say this. It will say that coma or prolonged deep sedation has been an essential tool of critical care for the past 50 years, and it enables the body to have a deeper form of rest, and which allows recuperation and the drugs and natures to do their bit, and the experience should be a blank. So that's the basically textbook explanation of what happens with a coma, and it's a blank, as they say. Well, I'm a journalist, can't just take one answer, so I thought I better just have a look around. Had plenty of time on my hands. Facebook, I think, was my very, very first port of call. There are a handful of coma survivor groups on Facebook, and the one in particular called the Coma Survivors Group. I got in touch with the admin and explained what I thought I was doing, which at that time was possibly writing an article, but I was probably even bluffing then because I wasn't even sure what I was going to do with this. And he allowed me to watch from the sidelines, as it were, to read the posts that people were putting up, not to contact them directly at this stage, but just to see. And three things really stood out. One, the recovery time seems to take forever if it ever gets better. Regardless of why people were placed into the coma in the first instance, they all seem to be exhibiting more or less the same physical symptoms, as in muscle wastage, balance problems, hair, nails falling out, all sorts of things, and cognitive problems and memory issues. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, there was a third thing, a third pattern in the threads, and that was the events within coma. Now, hold on a second. It's supposed to be a blank. So, what are these people recalling? Now, because I mean, there's no real terminology for this, and if there is, they've acquired it from the medical world. So they will say things like, "Oh, I hallucinated terribly in my coma." Well, first off, hallucinations are conscious state, invariably with the eyes open, so that doesn't really seem to work. Okay, they talked of coma dreams. But if your brain's been switched off, you don't go through your circadian rhythms, you don't experience REM sleep, at what point are you going to dream? So I just became really intrigued by this. So the next stage was let's talk to some doctors about it. But I thought first I've got to read up on the subject so I know what I'm talking about. So I tried to find some medical or scientific papers, real pucker things, that advocate prolonged deep sedation because they don't generally call it coma. Well, I couldn't find any. My wife's a private investigator, and she's really good at finding things that other people can't find, and she couldn't find them either. So I thought I'll cut to the chase. I got in touch with the editors of the medical journal, The Lancet, and I said, could you point me to any articles you've done advocating prolonged deep sedation? Took them a while. They came back to me and said, there aren't any. We can't find any. And subsequently, I spoke to an awful lot of doctors further down the line, doctors and nurses who've been on the same path, looking for anything that advocates prolonged deep sedation because it has been an essential tool of critical care for the past 50 years. There is, however, a wealth of medical literature absolutely decrying the practice. Now, it's one thing to put somebody into a coma for a brief period of time. If you're having a brain seizure, for example, I think most doctors would agree it's best to switch off the brain so it doesn't cause any damage. Complications after heart surgery, brain uses a lot of oxygen, slow it down or switch it off, gives the heart a better chance, and so on. And there's a few other instances. No one is suggesting that you should place people into a coma for weeks or months at a time, because prior to COVID, people were starting to realize the absolute damage that this was causing. Now, for example, bed rest. For the last 2,000 years, doctors have been saying things like, if you don't feel well, go to bed, take it easy. Well, it turns out that bed rest is enormously damaging. Just 1 week of bed rest can result in the loss of 40% of lean muscle, 40%, right, which is shocking. And you've got people in comas for months at a time. So what's happening to them? So the physical, I'm going off on a tangent now. The physical things that people suffer it should be so obvious. They're lying still. You're flipping them every 2 hours. You're pumping them full of meds. They're not going through the circadian rhythms. The kidneys don't go through the 24-hour cycle. It's not flushing all the rubbish out of the body. It stays in the system. When they get released, they don't look like they've got shocking muscle wastage because they're so pumped for the fluids. Uh, so they look all right. They probably can't walk if you've been in a coma for some period of time. You have to be wheeled out on a gurney. Uh, and I mean, oh, so I don't even remember how we got onto the point that I'm now making, but I get absolutely shocked. So yeah, so I then started trying to find some doctors and nurses. Luck would have it, there's a wonderful podcast called Walking Home from the ICU by Kaylee Dayton. She's a nurse practitioner in the US. And she has, from the beginning of her career, worked on an intensive care unit. She's worked other places subsequently. An intensive care unit that's called an awake and walking intensive care unit. They don't render people unconscious. They keep them active. They move them around. And hold on a second. So what a lot of doctors and nurses listening now will say, if anyone's on a mechanical ventilator, no one conscious can tolerate it. It's just too distressing and uncomfortable. Therefore, we have to render them unconscious. It's partially true. If you prep the person prior to putting the tube in, you sedate them to a suitable level. You put the tube in, you bring them out, and when they come to it, ideally they've got a family member sitting beside them, holding their hand, and all the rest of it. And in the same way that you and I haven't given a moment's thought to our breathing since we've been talking, sooner or later, that person on the ventilator won't be thinking about it either. Modern ventilators, they're not like old iron lungs or anything. They're all microprocessor controlled. And they allow a patient to initiate the breathing. So whilst it is uncomfortable, there's no doubt about that, it's not unbearable. And I've seen photographs of people sitting up in bed on mechanical ventilators, running a business on their laptop. I've seen photographs from Brazil where patients in an ICU are playing volleyball whilst on mobile ventilators. And it's crucial to get people up and about and moving. One, on the physical level, but if you've ever been in a hospital for a period of time, there's an aha moment when you actually get out of bed for the first time and you're getting better. The sooner you can do that, take heart surgery, for example. What they try and do after heart surgery is get the patient up. Nothing strenuous, sit on the end of the bed. Now move to a chair. A bit later, walk 50 paces. Walk 50 paces back. It makes them naturally tired, wears them out, then they have proper sleep. Whereas you conk somebody out with all this medication, they're not sleeping. Doctors will often tell the family of people in comas that your loved ones in having a deep, lovely sleep. Well, they're not sleeping, and they become sleep deprived. And you haven't got to look very far before you realise that sleep deprivation is enormously damaging. It's used universally as a torture prior to interrogation. It softens people up. When they've done extensive tests on rats and kept them awake for long periods of time, massive damage to their brain and so on and so forth. So, the people in that situation are really, really suffering, and people were starting to notice this prior to the pandemic. But when the pandemic hit, they became so overwhelmed, and they just didn't know what to do. There's a thing called ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, which was invariably fatal. And the best way to deal with an ARDS patient is to really render them unconscious, put them on a ventilator, just keep them, calm and all the rest of it, and eventually they'll die. And they thought, well, that's what we ought to do with COVID. Because for one thing, we can't maintain, someone's in a coma, we can't maintain the 2 nurses to 1 patient ratio. There's no way that's ever going to happen. You've got rooms stuffed, you've got corridors stuffed, you've got tents in the car park stuffed with people in comas. So they figured the best thing to do was render them senseless, make them manageable, flip them over every 2 hours. If they survive, all well and good, we move them down the line. So people were waking up prior to COVID to the dangers, the physical dangers and the cognitive harm. And then they just went straight back after COVID, during COVID, and now stuck in this mode where hospitals are cash strapped, they're short staffed. An awful lot of the very experienced ICU staff burnt out early on and won't go back. They've had to call people in from pediatrics, geriatrics, and wherever, and they just do what they're told. And the protocol from that hospital says render them senseless, put them into a prolonged state of deep sedation, and see how things turn out. So I found I was looking at something that was remarkably strange. And as I got to know more and more people, both the doctors and the nurses and the coma survivors, I realized I'm not writing articles. I'm not even writing a series of articles. I'm going to have to make this into a book. And then the question arises, hold on a second, how are you going to get a publisher? For the subject is coma, right? A blank in somebody's lives, possibly the most boring subject you could ever have for a book. Right? But it turns out not to be the most boring subject. To me, it's one of the most fascinating areas I've ever explored.
Well, it's one of these things, isn't it? The idea of it's what David Chalmers many years ago, an Australian philosopher, called the hard problem of science.
Yeah.
How consciousness is developed by basically inanimate matter. Where does consciousness come from? And then you have the question, and where does consciousness go when, due to chemical intrusions within the brain, consciousness seems to disappear in some way? And as you probably know, there's been the work done by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hamerhoff with their orchestrated objective reduction, and the idea that somehow consciousness works using quantum effects in one way or another. And I know that both Penrose and Hamerhoff were fascinated by the fact that nobody really understands what anesthetics do. They know the effect of them, but they don't understand them. But we're playing here with things. Now, one of the points I thought you made a very pertinent point there, and it's a point I've made many times in my interviews, is that there is this labeling theory that I call it, which is effectively, if you don't understand something, give it a label, preferably Latin or Greek, and make it like a nice acronym. And like ICU delirium, which you mention in your book.
Yeah.
And therefore, then, whenever anybody has these experiences in their report, when they come out of the delirium state, we've defined it. We know what it is because it's ICU delirium, but they have no idea what ICU delirium is.
I know. Now, and if they did, they realise how fatal it can be for patients. That your chances of survival in an intensive care unit, you get delirium, your chances of survival are cut in half or greater.
And the question then is, which you answer wonderfully in the book by example after example, of where do the people go? One of the major, I've just finished a book on near-death experiences, and one of the major arguments in near-death experiences, when people have near-death experiences, when they're effectively flatline, where there's no brain activity, where are the visions coming from? Where is the imagery? Now, a number of your cases are extraordinary. So moving on then, so you see these stories and then you contact these individuals. And there's one or two cases that I really would like to drill into with you. But for the moment, so what was the first time that you realised when you were talking to someone that something extraordinary was taking place?
I think fairly early on, I met Nick MacDonald. And I didn't find him on Facebook. I found him on Quora or somewhere.
Funnily enough, it's the Nick case that was the one that caught my eye. That's interesting.
Well, he's not the only person that spoke to me about having alternate lives spanning decades, rich in every detail, utterly vivid. He's not the only one. He's the one I focused on in the book. Nick's had a clear run of 20 years living in the United States, which is where he's from in this world. He even did a tour of duty with the army in Southeast Asia. You can ask him all sorts of details about it. And
so just to go back, just to explain this, so he's put into a coma state, and suddenly he lives a whole 20 years of an alternate life in an alternate place, which I think they said it was orange tinged or something.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Meanwhile, 2 weeks only passing in this world.
Okay.
Nick says it was like the United States, but not the United States on a map. Things were rather mixed up. And whereas our atmosphere is blue, it was kind of orange there. And during the 20 years I was down, I don't think I ever saw my reflection in a mirror.
Mm.
Now, in that time, he did all sorts of things, as I said, touring duty in Southeast Asia, a string of relationships, madcap adventures, and all sorts. You know, a young man just doing sort of crazy kind of stuff. And eventually he settles down. He settles down in this town in the Midwest, and he has particular skills. His dad in this world was a big time motorcycle mechanic, and he really taught him lots of things, how to use his hands, you know. So it's like a natural fixing an engine. You can, you know, knock off some shelves, no problem at all, and it can grow anything. And that's the Nick in that world. The Nick in this world, right, couldn't change a light bulb, right, never grown a plant or anything. But here's weird. He comes out of his coma and he's back with his girlfriend, his fiance, and her heating and ventilation system breaks down. Takes the cover off, figures out the problem, goes to home base, buys the part, comes back, fixes it, and hey presto, the air conditioning unit's working. This is a man who could never change a light bulb, and he's thinking, how the heck did I know that? And then he runs a food business, and he has a walk-in freezer, and it bust, and had the engineers come round, and they couldn't get the temperature down at all, and they said you're going to have to scrap it. And he was watching them doing this, and he realised he thought they were putting too much Freon into the system. Now, I mean, what the heck's Freon? Thinks Nick. How do I know this? They leave, he lets some Freon out, and it's back to its work at normal temperature. Now, he doesn't know how he does this, and he's brought these skills back with him. So, you know, this is not something, you know, that the dying brain has conjured up, right? That he has tapped into some other reality, some other memories or whatever. But he's living this in real time. It's not like he's watching it at the cinema or anything. You know, he's there. He gets frostbite at one point, you know, and it really hurts. And he's in hospital, and his feet are all bandaged, and all the rest of that. He's living life as fully as we, you know, you and I. He's holding down jobs. You know, he's going on vacation. He's getting married. He has a kid, and then he's not feeling well. He's got problems with his wife, and you know, marriage is sort of breaking down. And he's on his own, and he's not feeling well, and he just feels like the whole floor is collapsing underneath him, and everything turns orange. And orange figures a lot, by the way, and yellow in these experiences. Next thing you know is he opens his eyes and he's in hospital, which might figure if you weren't feeling well. And there's this woman holding his hand, and he hasn't got a clue she is. She's claiming to be his fiance, and he's already married, so he doesn't know who she is. And this is really common. People come out of comas; they don't know who these people are, and you can't speak initially if you've been on a ventilator because of damage to vocal cords. Sometimes it takes weeks to get your voice back. So he's wanting to say, "I'm sorry, miss, I think you're in the wrong room or something," and he can't say anything. Other people, at one point, the person told me when she came out of a coma, she didn't even know what humans were. Um, you know, and then if you mention this at some point down the line, and you can't mention it straight away to the people in intensive care because you haven't got the ability to speak, and you get shunted down the line. You try to tell people these things, and they just think, "Well, dear, you've been on a lot of drugs, haven't you, recently? What do you expect?" And they get dismissed. And if ICU delirium ever pops up, it's like explain to them like, "Oh, it's a blip. This is just a result of you being in bed for a few weeks, and it will soon pass. And yes, of course, your memory will come back, and all the rest of it. And of course, it doesn't. And then they get diagnosed with dementia or what have you." One of the doctors, Dr. Wes Ely, who helped us with the book, he wrote the foreword, Chief of Medicine at Vanderbilt Medical School. He became really alarmed that he was causing damage to his patients. And one of his patients was a mathematical whiz, absolute genius, and placed in a coma. He follows her up, which is almost unheard of in ICU terms because they're too busy dealing with the next patient. He follows her up, and he finds that she can't even manage her checking account. So she had a listed IQ of 140. So they do an IQ test on her. it's 100, which is like, pretty dim. And so they scanned her brain, and she was in, I think, 35, and she had the brain of an old woman with dementia. That there'd been such wastage in parts of her brain that they were never going to come back. It wasn't a blip that was going to get better.
Now this is extraordinary. Now I'll guarantee you will not be aware of this. And by the way, folks who are watching this, I have not primed Alan. So people will be going, oh, he's saying things Anthony Peake writes about and has been for years, and they're colluding. And this is not the case, because I have a concept called cheating the ferryman. And in cheating the ferryman, I can explain neurologically what's taking place in these things. And my model, we're not talking about me now, but I'm just saying to the people listening, this is evidence. But I'll give you a couple of examples of where my work has gone, where your work is similar here. In that, if you read the work of, his name has escaped me now, but he was a very famous out-of-body experience. He was the guy that defined out-of-body experience, Bob Monroe.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And Robert Monroe, in his book, Journeys Out of the Body, he has an entity he calls I there. And when he goes in out-of-body experiences, he would find himself in the body of somebody else, living a parallel life, where he literally would drop in. Now, I've written various books on drop-ins in terms of mediumship and everything, and it's as if the consciousness drops into somebody else's aware consciousness. And he would drop into the visual system of this guy he called I there. And there was one classic case where he's out of his body and he finds himself inside this other person's body, and the guy's having negotiations, business negotiations. And the guy's wife is looking at him, and of course he's confused because he doesn't know what to say.
Why am I here?
And this happened to him on regular occasions. Now, to me, this is evidence that we exist in parallel universes, and our consciousness can flip from one to the other, depending upon certain sets of circumstances. And I would argue that when people are in coma states, and it was only your book that made me realise this, the coma states are just as much part of this phenomenon as everybody else. Now, so this guy, when he had this other life, literally, and of course he had time dilation taking place here as well. So he had this whole period where he was in coma for 2 weeks, but he was somewhere else for a much longer period of time. So, and again, what we'll do is I'll give you the opportunity. I won't ruin my books for you. The guys who will watch this know the things I talk about.
Spoiler alert. Yeah.
But absolutely. Now, the other thing that you mentioned here, which again, there was so many notes I wanted to make here, the idea of some individuals that say, they can't move, that they're actually trapped inside the body. And of course, that's a classic sleep paralysis scenario, the beast sitting on the chest.
Yeah.
And, like, for instance, there's the story of somebody called Zara Slattery that you talk about.
Yeah.
And her imagery. Can you tell us a little bit about this? Because this is hypnagogic imagery writ large.
Yeah, she said it was she wasn't yet in a coma. I mean, she was in vast amount of pain. She had an infection on her leg, and they said, you're going to go in for an op, and you may have a limp afterwards. Well, things went wrong, and they cut the leg off right up to her spine. And so she's in this recovery stage, not in a coma at this point. And first of all, she sees lights flashing in front of her eyes, and it looks like a medieval skeleton. And she thinks later, looking back, that maybe they were shining a light in her eyes to see if she was conscious. And then she was aware of the people at the end of the bed, and they were half human, half skeleton, their faces. And it was unbelievably terrifying. And she said this set the course for her journey, that it was one of fear and guilt and just absolute horror. And the things she went through, and when they're again, not in a coma, but in a situation where she's floating between this life and possibly the next, they put her inside like an MRI type of scanner. And she thinks she's in a coffin and it's going into a crematorium. And she thinks her husband and her kids are inside with her. And this is how she's perceiving these events. And it's shocking how doctors and nurses don't really appreciate how the patient sees things. For example,
Mm.
um, an awful lot of them refer to rape within their coma, that they were raped. Some give birth, by the way. Um, Others talk of just sexual assault. Now, this is very likely at their bath or when they're inserting various catheters and tubes and whatnot into a person. One person told me she was a medical uh, person in South Africa, so she knew all her staff, and they put her with COVID into a coma. And she perceived that as kidnap. She was being held and she was paralyzed in her kidnap state. And the kidnapper had knotted a toothbrush and inserted razor blades into it, and she was just slicing away into her gums. Now, again, because she was a medical practitioner herself, she realized that was the nurse cleaning her teeth with a toothbrush out of absolute kindness and had no idea what she was putting people through. And so often the events, certainly within an early stage, let's put it, the hospital weaves itself into a nightmare world where the hospital staff, who would be kind, caring professionals, turn into cruel, callous sadists who are out to kill you and all the rest of it. So many people recounted this to me, that this is how they perceive them when they wake up and they can get their eyes open. It's the same people in the room again, and they're convinced that nurse is really the angel of death, and so on. And doctors and nurses don't appreciate what they're putting the patient through. And this is just the early levels. We mentioned Sarah Slattery. She's not yet in a coma. When she's in a coma, she actually has quite nice things by comparison. Um, but this early stage, and it can set the tone as well. I mean, it's a number of people, I can't think how many now overall, had the same experience within a coma, that they found themselves in an organ harvesting
Yeah.
facility. Um, the one with the toothbrush I was telling you, she came to, and she woke up. Here's the thing: if people were recounting events within coma, they say, "I woke up and found myself in such a place." Well, she woke up and found herself in a organ harvesting facility. She was kept 4 years in a coffin, and they found a way to grow organs, kill her, regrow organs, kill her, regrow organs, kill her. And she had to just keep going through this over and over again until she willed herself to die. And then she found herself in an NDE type sort of setting, pastoral landscape, beautiful sunny day, all the rest of it. And she found a stairway to heaven, an old gnarled staircase. And she knew that at the bottom was life where she was there. But if she climbed to the top, it was death. And she gleefully climbed to the top. And when she got to the top, she could hear people say, "It's not your time. You must go back." And she says, excuse my language, "I was so pissed off. I just stomped back down those stairs. I was so angry." um, the experiences people have, when we look at NDEs, we tend to, generally speaking, hear the nice ones. Like the Evan Alexander kind of thing. You go to
Yeah.
heaven, your sister's a butterfly, whatever. I suspect there's an equal number, and that we're proving this. I suspect there's an equal number of distressing NDEs. But like a lot of bad things in life, people are not that willing to talk about them.
Yes.
And so many of the people, in fact, every single one of the people I spoke to, after the event, said they thought they'd gone mad.
Mm.
Now, particularly when you've had an horrendous thing like being in an organ harvesting facility for 4 years, you're not going to talk about it so readily because you're going to look pretty nuts. Now, if you wander the sea of daffodils or something, you might mention it, and that gets put down as an NDE. But they keep it to themselves. So I don't think these things are coming out the way they should do, and
Well,
I don't think enough attention's being made
I think the
to
problem
find it.
is, in my last book, I read virtually every academic paper that had been written on near-death experiences for the last 40, 50 years. And you're quite right. There seems to be this kind of fear of negative near-death experiences. It must be because of the Christian ethos, the idea of you go to heaven and it's going to be idyllic fields and the Elysian fields and it's going to be wonderful. Whereas clearly there are others that are not. And I think what happens with the others is, and it's shown by your other person, Janine, in
Oh,
that what
yeah.
is happening here is that she's not only having sleep paralysis, but she even uses the term the old hag. She
Yeah.
sees in it the old
Yeah.
hag, which is,
Yeah.
if you look at the painting by Fuseli, the
Oh,
Anglo-Swiss
mm,
artist, The
mm,
Nightmare, and you see a
mm.
lady lying on the bed and there's a creature sitting on her chest.
Yeah,
And there's, of
succubus.
course,
Yeah.
there's the horse looking in through the window, which is the Nightmare. But the
Mm.
thing is, the old hag is a trope that you get, and it tends to happen in those liminal states between being asleep and awake, hypnagogic states.
Mm.
And in the hypnagogic state, you will see a cowled figure, usually in profile, that will turn around and look at you. But then this morphs into a much more important area, which fascinates me in my writings. And this is the idea of alien abductions and shamanic traveling, and the way in which it's visceral. The person is dismembered. They have their guts torn open. They have terrible things done to them by the greys. Like, for instance, we are both friends of Jeff
Yes.
Kripal, and Jeff
Yeah.
Kripal has written books with Whitley Strieber. And if you look at Whitley Strieber's abduction stories, there are awful things done to him, sexual things done to him by the aliens, which is exactly in your book. And when I was reading, little lights were going on in my head. And I was thinking, this is the bridge. This is the bridge between all the phenomenon. And can you just tell us a little bit more about Janine's story and the way she's shamanic traveling? It sounds like a DMT dream, ayahuasca. It's all there with that particular case, isn't it?
Yeah, it was also very filmic as well.
Yeah.
Like in cinema terms. But she finds herself in the back of a wooden cart being pulled by a horse. She's stark naked. She's not tied down, but she can't move. She's completely paralyzed. And this crops up a fair bit. Not always, not everyone's paralyzed, but a number of them tell me that they are within their settings. And she's in this on this horse and cart, and it's going down a cobbled road. And she can see like the moon behind her that way, and it's going into the distance. She goes down and down, and it goes on forever. She can't measure the time; it just seems interminable amount of time. And then they arrive at this old theatre, and she's taken out of this, and she's chained up from the ceiling. And there's an old hag, the one you described, and she's got this funny little golem-like creature running around underneath her cape, and she's got a big staff, and she's banging her staff on the ground, and it's making the most terrible, terrible noise. And Janine is like, she never got a chance to say goodbye to her family, and this is obsessing her that she's dying, she'd go to hell possibly, that she never got to say goodbye to her family. And she tries to, she wants to give up fighting at this point and just give in because it's just too much and just die again, like the earlier story. And she hears her partner's father, who had passed away only recently, and very clearly he says to her, "Look, girl, pull yourself together. You need to be strong. They need you. Get yourself strong. Go back." And she does. And she finds herself going in reverse, like the film's being played backwards up this hill. And then she comes to within the hospital. And because she's all agitated from the distressing events, and this is really common. People coming out of COVID become agitated, not always, but often, and they will rip the tubes and the pipes, and they will tear them. She says that she punched a nurse, and what they tend to do in a situation like that is, because they don't want to see the patient distressed and agitated, they just up the meds and they push them back. Now, there's James who helped me with the book, and he had a whole bunch of horrendous things. But he was stuck in a loop for a time where he had to watch his wife dying in childbirth. Now, he's not married in this world, but he watches this over and over and over again. If they're bringing him out of the coma at that point, which they will do eventually, hopefully, he comes out fighting and biting, and desperate not to go back there. And what do? They up the meds and they send him back, and he has to watch his wife dying over
How
and over
terrifying.
again. Yeah, absolutely.
That is the nature of nightmares, isn't it?
Isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it? One person helped me, Kiara. She was 15, only just 15 when she was placed into a coma. When she had some really, really horrible, but they weren't great, and she was desperate to get out of this world that she was in. she came to, they were reducing her meds, and she was so desperate, she told me to cling on to anything of this world that she started ripping all the pipes out. And there's blood gushing from her chest. And she says, this felt so sweet because I was back here, me, because all she had been, to a large part of it, was a dismembered mind, no body, just in a void, a black void. And she's a kid and she's calling out for her mum, Mummy, Mummy, come and wake me up. I've been sleeping too long. This isn't right. And the doctor sent her straight back again.
Well, this is intriguing. There are two or three things, again, that leapt to mind there. And it's something I posted on Facebook literally a few days ago. Or was it? Or I responded to somebody anyway. But somebody had posted about the Gaspar Noé film, Irreversible. I don't know if you know Irreversible.
Oh, I'm not sure. Not sure.
You will never forget it. It's a horrific rape happens. But the film goes backwards. That's why it's called Irreversible. And it goes backwards. And at the start of at the end of the film, or I can't remember which bit it is now, but one of the main character, she's reading a copy of J.W. Dunn's An Experiment with Time. And in Experiment with Time, he argues, as I do in my book, The Labyrinth of Time, that time is cyclical. It repeats itself. It repeats like the eternal return, the eternal recurrence, and that we live multiple lives and they are repeating all the time. They're repeating in parallel. And there are different versions of us that are all subtly different, that are living slightly different lives. And in this, I apply quantum mechanics to this, the Everett's many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, and also the idea that we are all effectively collapsing the wave function of our reality. So subatomic particles are a statistical position where a particle might be, but as soon as they observed, a statistical wave function becomes a point particle. And if the whole of the universe is made of subatomic particles, this means there's a direct relationship between consciousness and external reality. Now, so I'm talking about this, and I mention this as well, and I then mention to the person I'm talking to, because the person says, well, why does Gaspar Noé have such awful imagery in his films? And the reason he does is that he suffers from temporal lobe epilepsy. Okay, he has temporal lobe epilepsy. Now, you mentioned status epilepticus on a couple of occasions in your book, and I think this is absolutely crucial. As you said, Ibn Alexander, when he was having his near-death experience, was in a deep state of status epilepticus. And I believe that epileptic seizures seem to open up the doors of perception, for want of a better term. As you mention about the work of Aldous Huxley and his doors of perception, and you point out about 5-MeO-DMT, you discuss about DMT, ayahuasca, all these things are related, and ketamine, which you mentioned, ketamine, which you also mentioned. So here we have all these kind of areas of proving effectively my thesis, which is basically scientific and neurochemical in basis. But your reports are very much massively supporting my hypothesis through what happens to people. Like there's somebody else you mentioned, and I thought it was fascinating, was Isabel Wells, where she has many lives.
Oh, many people have many lives. But you could also look at Isabel's as many deaths.
Yeah.
Because she for me, she catalogued a series of deaths. She was fighting apartheid in South Africa, her native home, and she was attacked on a railway track and killed. And she lived so many different lives at different times. And James, another one who had these multiple lives, but again multiple deaths. And one day we were chatting, and he just, like out of nowhere, just started to rattle them off. I was a Spitfire pilot in the Second World War. I crashed in the Thames. I died. I was a fisherman loading fish at a dock. There was an accident. I drowned. I was locked in a metal box as a punishment. It was filled with water. I drowned. I was flying a really, really old plane over the Caribbean. It crashed into the sea. I drowned. And just on and on and on and on. And it's just like they're picking up on all these past lives, but picking up on the final moment to tell. When you ask people to recount, events within coma, it's a bit like if I were to ask you, Tony, recount your life for me, please, quickly. You can't recount your life. It's just, it would take how old you are to recount your life. And people just, I know, they just can't explain to anybody what they're going through. No one can understand this. You try and tell somebody you've had all these multiple lives, and it was like fantasy. What, you're a red Indian and all that
Yeah.
stuff, you know?
Well, the thing is as
But
well
they weren't. They
here.
were normal people
Well,
living normal lives,
yeah,
fishermen, no
it's
one else.
it's again the idea, if consciousness can be reduced down from the what in the Kabbalah would be called the Or Ein Sof, or is called in Vedanta, Brahman, the idea that we are one singular consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. If that is the case, then there are levels of consciousness. So there's individuated ego conscious, which I call the Eidolon. Then there is the demonic consciousness, which is the memory of all your lives that you've lived as you, like Connors does in the movie Groundhog Day. Well,
Yeah,
he lives
well,
a
yeah,
day,
right. Yeah.
but I argue you live that life and you can attune into that. But then above that, I have a concept which is the equivalent of somebody you clearly admire, Jung, because you have a whole section on Jung,
Yeah, I mean, yes, of course.
and are tuning
Um,
into the collective unconscious. And this is what I think happens in these extended states of consciousness, whereby consciousness can access what Irvin Laszlo calls the holographic field, the quantum vacuum. And in the quantum vacuum, all information is there. The information, the data information that runs this universe, that runs this simulation, as Andrew Gallimore would argue, is instantation. So the idea is that when we go into these states, we cease to be an individuated conscious, and we become a much broader conscious awareness where we attune in to other people's lives. And what concerned me with your example was there is somebody that is tuning into everybody's deaths, one after
yeah,
the other. You
because
know,
I think that's the last thing in that particular memory, and it's easier to recount your death than say your entire life. I
very
speak to
true.
people,
Yeah, I like the
and
point.
tell me about. Let's talk to Nick. Tell me about your life. He can only tell me bits of it. The highlights. When I got married, when I was in the army, that kind of stuff. He, but he can remember so much. But he's aware of so much more. And it's only that these things come to light by sheer chance. Reference
Yeah.
on TV to something. You go, oh right, yeah, I remember doing that now. That kind of
And
thing.
that's where deja vu takes place, isn't it? It's the
There you go.
recognition of
Look
circumstances where you
at
go,
that.
oof,
A
I've done this
similarity.
before. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
again, somebody else. I
Yeah,
mean, again, there's so many areas. You referenced Julian Jaynes and the bicameral mind theory, but
yeah.
also you've always gone. I mean, Carl Pribram and the holographic memory stuff, and then I was astonished when you even referenced Darrell Treffert, who's been a previous guest on this show before he died. Because of course Treffert was arguing these ideas again about savant syndrome and the way in which we know much more than our everyday consciousness can become aware of.
I mean, the reason I touched on so many of those things was I was looking for parallels, the things that people are experiencing within coma. There are parallels to the NDE, obviously. The reported endlessly. You go back to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, you'll find NDE accounts. But oh dear, losing my train there. I've lost my train of thought. This is the trouble with this book. It sends me all over the place. Yeah,
This,
right. So I was looking for parallels. Here we
yeah,
go. I was going off on one. Right. And the closest parallel I could find was with DMT experiences. Now, um, I spoke to people who've been doing ayahuasca, the Amazonian mystic brew, and
like Benny
they're
Sherman, yeah.
they're recounting to me events that sound remarkably like coma, remarkably like coma. And then I read Vic Strassman's book, the Spirit Molecule, about his DMT trials. And what's going on in those trials and people are recounting unbelievably similar to what's happening within coma. So that led me to look at DMT and how it might manifest itself. Now, sensory deprivation would certainly appear to be a case. And it's a good argument to say that if you're in a coma, you're in the deepest form of sensory depth because you've got no senses at all. And so if you look at the prisoner's cinema, if you're confined to a solitary cell on your own, a blank cell, after a point in time, very quickly, your mind will start creating images, possibly to keep you amused. There's all sorts of theories as to why. Geometric patterns, oriental motifs. And in time, this will turn into other realities. There'd be other people in yourself, other location that you're in. And then I thought, okay, I found out about dark retreats. I didn't know what a dark retreat is.
Oh,
Now, a
this is
dark,
weird. Somebody literally yesterday messaged me to say,
haha,
have you tried dark retreats? This is uncanny, but this is the way it
okay.
works. This is the
Well,
way it
this is
works, folks. Genuinely, it was yesterday, and I'd never heard of
right.
it before. So
There you go.
tell me, what are they?
Synchronicity.
What are they?
So, a dark retreat. It's a bit like being a mystic or a guru from the days of old who would take themselves off to the darkest recesses of caves to cut themselves off from the physical world to commune with the spirit world. Well, you can book these things online now. And one person I spoke to, she spent 40 days in complete and utter darkness. She was fed through an airlock type hatch, so there was no contact with the outside world. Very small. It was in Ecuador. It was really cold. She had to work all the year in a coat the whole time. And pretty soon, and she's trying to meditate and do her yoga and these things. And pretty
Can I
soon,
just jump in here? This is
yeah,
very
go on.
important, very important. In my second to last book, I had a section on, you mention about the crystal palace and the pineal gland and everything else as well. But I argue that what is taking place, they go into darkness. There's things people call the mamas, which are in the mountains in Colombia, where children are taken from birth and they're kept in darkness. Now, I argue that I've been working with an associate of Rick Strassman on this. And what we believe is taking place is when you go into darkness, the pineal gland goes into overdrive, creating melatonin. And of course, melatonin can be synthesized into something that my associate calls metatonin, which is endogenously generated dimethyltryptamine. So when you go into these darkened states, the pineal gland starts to excrete endogenous, as Jimo Borgigin in your book, as you mentioned.
Yeah,
Jimo
yeah.
Borgigin discovered in her work, and in my new book on near-death experiences, I expand on this, is that this is what it's doing. It's generating the hallucinate, as Rick Strassman said, didn't he? That DMT, endogenous DMT, is in fact our reality modulator.
Well, yeah, I mean, as Arnold Seth
He
says,
does indeed.
I, we're hallucinating all of the time. It's only when we agree on our hallucinations do we call it reality.
That's it. It's the only reason it is considered an hallucination is it's individuated. And collectively, we are collectively hallucinating all the time. Anil Seth, I don't think, goes into the quantum mechanics like I do. He goes into the neurochemistry. He doesn't go
Yeah, I
into
think
the
he's got
quantum
enough to
mechanics.
keep himself busy there.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, he does. No, his work is fantastic, and I highly recommend anyone read his work. Um, but the things that people are experiencing within these dark retreats resemble coma with uncanny
Wow.
similarities. So I spoke to Emma, who ran that particular dark retreat, and by the time I spoke to her, she'd had about 500 people pass through there. And I showed her some coma events from the people who were helping me with the book. Okay. After a bit, she just laughs, and she said, "Well, I've had all of these. The nightmares are fairly common early on within a dark retreat. Entities creeping towards you, reaching forward and touching your arm and all the rest of it. So much like things people telling me within coma." And and she says, like, for example, so many of the people within a dark retreat, that she said, you're calling them alternate lives. We tend to see them as past lives. And they're not necessarily living them minute by minute on a 20-year run or anything. They're just aware of these past lives. So DMT appears to be something that really needs to be examined. But the trouble is, ethically, you can't really do it. Now,
But
I'm of the belief that as you're dying, for example, maybe the body is chucking out DMT, perhaps to ease your passing or whatever, and this is the formation of the near-death experience. But ethically, you can't test.
But they are
You
doing
can't
it. But they are doing it.
tell me how.
Imperial College are doing it. You mention Anton Bilton.
Yes.
And I think Anton Bilton is involved in this. Dr. David Luke, who's another friend of
Oh,
mine,
good. I'm
he's
pleased to
involved
hear
in it.
that. Yeah.
And they're doing this now. Again, if you go into listening to my previous interviews, if you look back for an interview I did with Carl, oh God, I'm getting old, so I'm forgetting people's names now. But an
Yeah,
associate mate called Carl. He's a university lecturer, and he's been involved in one of the volunteers taking DMT intravenously
wow.
and going and meeting entities. And they're
Yeah,
meeting entities and they're communicating with entities. And this is being done at Imperial College. And I know that
good,
Anil Seth is aware of this work as well.
good.
There's a number of researchers. Carl H. Smith is the guy's name, by the way. Carl Hayden Smith. Check it out, because the work they are doing and the work you are doing is extraordinary. Your book, I cannot stress how important your book is.
Oh,
Really, genuinely. It is something that Jeff Kripal says in the introduction. Your book is very, very, very important. And it is the kind of the book that, for my work, it's another piece in my jigsaw puzzle. I mean, really seriously, I'm so enthusiastic now, and I'm sorry I keep butting in. But
no. We're having the conversation. Yeah,
but your work is really is a counterpoint to mine and a number of other people. We're all working. I think, a group of us are going to get together one day, and we're going to sit there and we're going to put all the pieces together. And then the universe implodes and ceases to exist.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that they're doing more DMT trials after Strassman. I'm really pleased about that. But what I'd like to see, and this is where it becomes ethically difficult, is that at the point of death, that to see if there's an increase in DMT production. Could you not do it for people who are in coma to see if there's increased DMT in this system?
Well, funnily
no
enough,
one's doing that. Using animal models, rats giving them heart attacks,
it's not
and
saying.
they're saying 600% increase in DMT in this system.
Yeah, funnily enough, the person who's been doing that, Charlotte Martial, I think it is. I got in touch with only 2 days ago to discuss her work, because I think it's quite important what she's doing as well. But on top of this, I mean, for instance, in my latest book on near-death experiences, I discovered a case of a guy living in Germany who actually died while he was under an fMRI scanner. So they were able to scan the brain. So they have actually a brain scan.
Yeah.
And what happens here is fascinating, Alan, because what happens is the person dies, and then around about 9 to 10 seconds afterwards, there's a massive kick of activity, which mirrors Jimo Borgigin's discoveries. We now know that this happens in the human brain. And this is why your work is so important, because we need now, myself, my associates, you and I working together, whoever, we need to start looking into coma, because this is the area that we could break through.
It's mad. When I started looking at this, I didn't think I was going to write a book, because there's obviously loads of books on this. I was just doing this by curiosity. There are no books on this subject.
No, there are
books about coma-ish, but nothing like what we've done here with explore events within coma. Get the accounts from people who've been in coma and look for the parallels, etc., etc. No one's ever done that. It's blowing my mind. And yet they've been doing it for 50 years.
Yeah.
These poor people. Every year around the world, millions of people are placed into coma.
They're not listening to them,
because
because
not listening to anyone.
What they are saying does not fit in with the present scientific paradigm, the materials reductionist paradigm. And because it doesn't fit, they ignore it.
Yes, that's exactly what they do. If you don't understand it, don't talk about it.
Yeah,
completely blank. Absolutely. So it's a hallucination. It's a false memory. It's delirium. Your brain made this up as you're coming out of consciousness to make up for the missing time. Well, hold on a second. If you've been unconscious, how do you know for how long? Are you looking at your watch? Have you been unconscious for 9 days or 9 seconds? You don't know. So why are you trying to fill the space? If you wake up in hospital and open your eyes, your mind, is going to conclude that you've had some mishap that's led to you being in hospital. Why recreate an entire life involving a different partner, different children, different job, different occupation, different everything, right? Is your brain's way of comforting you for finding itself in the hospital bed.
And of course, they don't then turn around and talk to the doctors who are doing research into near-death experiences. And one of the moody traits is the panoramic life review. They don't go, that's interesting. And there are people like you and I doing this, but because we are outsiders, we are not part of the confining worldview of. It's in plain sight, isn't it? It's there. It's so obvious.
I approached this as a roughy, toughy journalist that used to cover wars and disasters, that kind of thing. I thought dead meant dead. Now, having taken this journey, having spoken literally to people who've died and come back, my entire outlook has changed. I know we don't die. Halfway through researching this book, my daughter died.
Oh,
Absolutely, like, worst thing happened to a human, let alone a parent. Worst thing. Now, obviously, I had the initial, whoa, shock, etc. But simultaneously, I knew she wasn't dead because I've spoken to people who died and they weren't dead. And if we just look at the first law of thermodynamics, right, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Well,
yep.
my daughter Rebecca was a ball of energy. So where did that go? Yeah, had to
Yeah.
go somewhere. So I don't think Rebecca is dead, which is how I've coped with it. I'd still be a basket case if I hadn't been doing this book at the time. I would be a broken man, but I'm not because I think she's probably had her life. Perhaps we're all here to learn some lesson of one kind or another. Perhaps she's learned her lesson. Perhaps she's now moved on. Perhaps she's having another one. But she's not dead. Now, I would have, if you told me this, from time ago that your daughter would die, you'll think she's not dead. I would have thought I was completely and utterly mad. Right? But no, to me, it's completely logical. And it just
That's it.
makes more sense than the
You're
materialistic
extrapolating
nonsense.
logic here, aren't you?
Yeah,
You're not making crazy statements. You're backing this
no,
up with people's
no.
experiences. And after all, in the final analysis, what is empirical? Empirical means literally from experience.
Yeah,
Therefore,
really.
if people round the world and near-death experiences from my research and Greg Shushan's research are consistent,
Yeah,
there are
utterly
slight
consistent.
cultural changes and everything
Oh
else
no,
as
but
well.
that's important because I think that's comforting, isn't it? Let's say you die, you're moving into another plane. So much easier if it's familiar terrain.
Yes.
For example, one person who helped with the book, she lives in the Swiss Alps. Her near-death experience, she's in an alpine meadow. I guess if I've spoken to an Inuit from the far north,
Yes.
he or she would find themselves on the ice plains surrounded by seals and walruses. Yeah? Because that would be comforting to that person to help bridge that gap. So when a Japanese person has an NDE, right, they go into a cave.
Hmm.
And when a person dies in the Amazon, they step into a canoe and travel for 3 days upstream. Ancient Greeks would pay the ferryman, right? That's
Yeah.
to cross the
Hence,
River
hence
Styx.
my concept cheating the ferryman.
Yeah, there you go.
You know, it's extraordinary. I think we can go on for hours. I'm aware of time
Oh
now
yeah.
and everything else. So very very quickly, can you let everybody know about this wonderful book, where they can get hold of copies of it, and everything else, and your website and everything else as well? Because
Oh well,
believe
thank
me,
you.
folks, read my books and then read this. This will
Yeah,
blow
read those
your
first.
mind.
Thank you so much, Tony. Yeah, available from all good bookstores. It's also an audio book, and my name, Alan Pearce. It's also my website, alanpearce.com. Um, I just mentioned some of the books I've done in the past. I don't say too much
Oh
on
yeah,
there.
please do.
That's it, really. No, I'm not going to mention them here. I just
Okay.
do that on the website.
Okay.
And the book, yeah. Every day, not every day, but certainly every week, I hear from somebody who I got one just before I came on that, who's fascinated by distressing near-death experiences and the fact that they're haven't been taken that seriously. So I've got a discussion to have with her, and in the last week, a guy in Texas writes to me, and he's trying to break it all down and examine it, and no one out there can actually help and support him with what he believes is happening. And he finds my book, and it just resonates because, as you're saying, I'm just doing a logical,
Mm.
evaluation. One as a journalist, one day I might be researching a religious cult or looking at satellites or something. Different stories, different days. I just approached this as a journalist approaching a story. It just became so gripping I couldn't let go, and it became a book. And as a result, it has changed my life, the way I think about life. So yeah, I'm really, really proud of it, the book. And it's not hard work. It's really, really easy to read. And it's a
Mm.
book, actually, that's about people. It's about the coma survivors themselves are wonderful people in almost every instance that I mentioned in the book. And some of those wonderful doctors and nurses who've gone against the profession, people who have been ridiculed, In one case, threatened to have her license taken away because she wasn't sedating patients sufficiently or at all. And there's people really fighting, and it's like a history of medicine. It wasn't that long ago. 150 years ago, they laughed at the concept of washing your hands, and, and now you'd be horrified if a doctor delivered a baby without scrubbing up first. One day, someone's going to walk into a bookstore 50 years from now. They're going to find that book, and they're going to be horrified that people in the past used to be placed into medically induced comas for months at a time. It would seem so barbaric. And I'm hoping that we reach that point before 50 years. But like all medical things, it takes forever for this to get traction, as it were. And it's only because younger people are coming into the profession. They find that there's no medical literature advocating prolonged deep sedation. There's a wealth of it decrying it as a practice. They will learn this. They will then go onto a ward where the ward supervisor may say to them, "Oh yes, but our patients are much sicker than those ones they told you about at college. We have to knock them out." Maybe they'll argue the case. Maybe they won't. But eventually, that's how it will slowly change. And it won't be an overnight thing. Suddenly there's a giant revelation. Like everyone suddenly realized they had to wash their hands 150 years ago. It took forever. Bleeding people, draining blood. 2,000 years that went on for before they put a hold to that.
And
no one would think to do it now.
A perfect analogy. It really is.
But medicine, it's the history of this.
It's been absolutely wonderful, Alan. We will continue this discussion. We've just
please do, Tony.
So everybody, just to remind everybody, the book is called Coma and Near-Death Experience: The Beautiful, Disturbing and Dangerous World of the Unconscious by Alan and Beverly Pearce, with a foreword by E. Wesley Ely, MD. Really, really brilliant book. Thank you very much, Alan. It's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tony, thank you.
Thank you.